very, very happy you're here. And tonight we have a most excellent poet. Oh, I forgot your
name?
No, I didn't forget your name. Yeah, it's Carrie Fountain. But I forgot your bio. Let me go grab the bio.
You don't want to read it? Here, you can read it right.
Read it from there.
No, that's, yeah. Look,
Is that the most
sure.
recent bio? Okay, so this is for perpetuity. We're going on the internet. So Carrie Fountain's poems have appeared in American Poetry Review, Poetry in Tin House. Garrison Keillor Loves Her, 2 poems in 2 weeks, right? In May. Her first collection, Burn Lake, was a winner of the 2009 National Poetry Series Award, and which makes her too big time to be here in Malvern, because Malvern uses independent press, and Carrie's been published by Penguin, which, as you probably know, is not an independent press. It's a big damn deal. So, published by Penguin in 2010, she is writer-in-residence at St. Edward's University. They made a position just for her, so they wouldn't lose her. And St. Ed's in Austin, Texas. She lives here in Austin, Texas with the playwright Kirk Lynn, playwright and novelist now, Rules for Werewolves. Great, great book. And so welcome, Carrie Fountain.
Yay.
And this is her book, Instant Winner, which is available over in the corner by Ben. So, and thank you to Malvern, of course. So, Carrie, we always begin with why poetry?
My poetry.
Why poetry?
Start with the easy stuff first.
Yeah, exactly.
You mean like for myself?
Yeah, why are
poetry?
you a poet? What makes you pursue poetry as opposed to sculpture or interpretive dance?
Well, you've not seen my interpretive dance.
Oh.
That's related. First of all, I just love that it is an actual corner.
Yes.
It's an actual corner here. Poetry corner. I didn't know it was going to be so literal. It's really hard to say. I don't know that I've thought about it much, and I don't know where the urge to write poetry was confirmed, because no one in my family was really, literary or writing poetry. But as a child and as a young teenager, I wrote poetry. That was what I was just drawn to. I read a lot of kids' poems as a kid. I was really a big fan of Shel Silverstein, as all children of the 70s and 80s were. But then when I wrote, it wasn't like, I read a lot of rhyming verse, but I didn't write in rhyme when I first started writing poetry.
Wow.
It was free verse. So that's really weird to me, because I don't have a lot of memories of reading free verse poetry as a child, but that's where I went when I started writing poetry in like middle and high school.
Mm-hmm. Impressive.
Yeah, bad poems.
Oh.
I have them in a bin. My husband promises to burn them if I die prematurely.
Well, maybe a rephrasing then. So what does poetry do that other forms don't do?
Well, I think I can answer that now more clearly because I'm actually writing in another form.
Oh, what are you writing?
Year and a half or so, I've been writing a YA novel, very seriously writing it. I'm actually rewriting it now. And I feel like I'm trying to teach myself that craft as much as possible, the craft of novel writing. And only since I've been doing that have I realized just how different, they're not, crafts, the crafts of disciplines in writing are not interchangeable. And I feel like very little of my skill set in poetry transfers easily to novel writing. The skills that the work skills, the practice of poetry writing, the practice of writing that I developed as a poet, I think translates to just sort of sticking with it, even when I have felt very, very desperate to hurl it into, I guess, in my computer into infinite, the trash can on my computer, secure empty trash. And so I think now I can really clearly see that poetry writing to me has always been the place where I have gone to try to address the, you know, the questions of the basic questions of living. Like, what does it mean to be a self in a body in this world, and you know, those questions. So it's to me it's much more of a practice because I don't have a religion. I've always longed for a religion. Ever since I was a kid, I longed for a religion. I grew up in a family where my father's Latino family was very Catholic, and my family, my immediate family, my father and mother, were both not religious at all. And so I felt like there was a secret world of thought, and it was all about ritual and all about words, and you know, the catechism was all very mysterious to me, and I loved that, and I longed for it, and it wasn't. So I think I have a distorted, romantic view of religion, and so I've always I think this is where I've found a place to put all that longing in writing and reading poetry. You know, just the experience of poetry has, to me, been like that. Where writing a novel, writing a YA novel doesn't feel anything like that to me, you know.
So
I do love the teenagers, but...
Is magic too big a jump per word?
Magic, you know, you mean like the seeking of magic?
No, the magic of the written word, the magic in poetry.
Maybe when I'm reading it, I feel that. I don't know that I necessarily feel that when I'm writing it.
Who inspires you, or who's your, you know, gateway poet? I guess might be.
Gateway poet. You know, when I was 19, so I grew up in a small town in southern New Mexico and went to school there too. Went to school at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, you know, sort of stumbled into my first poetry workshop with the poet Tony Hoagland, who happened to be teaching there for like 2 years before he became famous Tony Hoagland, and went on to be famous Tony Hoagland elsewhere. And he had us read Ellen Dore Watson's translation of Adélia Prado, the Brazilian poet Adélia Prado, her book, The Alphabet in the Park. And I was sold. I was sold. It was like one of those things where, you know, the chances of me being in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and even stumbling into that poetry workshop with this, you know, great poet himself, who then introduces me to this other poet who has, I mean, she only has 2 books translated into English. So that was like 1990 that book came out, and now she just, a couple of years ago, had a second translation. She was definitely, I would say, my gateway poet. And she's a spiritualist, but she's like a die-hard, super-duper practicing Catholic. Like very similar to my grandmother's relationship to Christ and Mary. Like they're just all, like she has a special name she calls Jesus. She calls him Jonathan. So she came to the UT and everybody kept talking about, oh, like, you know, when you talk about Jonathan, you just feel like the sensual love you feel for Jonathan. And she was like, so I think she was sweating and third thinking like, oh, you think it's my lover, but I think it's Jesus Christ, at least in my interpretation. I think she's talking about Christ. But that like uber familiarity with that is just really, I loved it. It turned something that seems to me very formal and very distant into something really familiar. My grandmother used to do that. She used to have conversations with like the Virgin Mary. You know, just like, oh, you know, like just talking, like, oh my God, you know. She also used to have conversations out loud to her sister. And so I always thought her sister was dead, like she was talking to her dead sister. But I learned as I got older that her sister was alive and living in El Paso. She was just like having conversations with her. And she was awesome. She was really great. Very funny. But I've just really gravitated toward that. Though I haven't, you know, I don't think I've found that religion to be, I mean, you know, the politics of religion are complicated and hard to enter. So I feel like I've kept my distance from religion, but tried in this way to enter into the conversation with the spiritual, you know.
Beautiful. Other poets that you want to mention as well, since we're kind of
that I sort of got started reading?
Yeah.
I've always really been drawn to Laura Kosicki's work. We were just talking about
yeah.
Laura Kosicki a moment ago.
You gave me one of her books.
Yeah, I love her, and I love her. She also writes novels, and she writes adult novels, and she happens to write young adult novels. Why is it always so hard to name? I've always really loved Jane Kenyon's work, the poet Jane Kenyon. She didn't write enough poems. She died too young. Murray Howe was one of my teachers in school, and I again, just like the sort of luck of being in actual physical contact with someone whose work just blows your mind is wonderful. Merwin,
Yeah.
Stanley Kunitz.
So how did you get from Las Cruces to Austin? And
I packed up my car and drove here.
Had you been in, what was the impetus? Or?
To come to the Michener Center.
Okay. Yeah, so
Yeah,
you've been
in
accepted
2001. Yeah, so my husband and I met at the Michener Center, and so I moved from Las Cruces to Austin, the big city. I had been living in Albuquerque and elsewhere. I hadn't been there the whole time, but we moved to Austin, and it was, we had, I think, 2 weeks of class, so 2 big meetings of our class, and then between the second and the third meeting, September 11th happened. So we were all, like many of us, Kirk was already living here in Austin, but the rest of us, right, were from elsewhere, and we didn't know anyone, and we didn't have any friends, and so we became a really tight-knit group, that group of Michener Fellows, and also we had Naomi Shihab-Nye was our teacher.
Wow.
And I'm like a very simple person. Like I'm like, okay, like here's the table the first day of class. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna marry that one, and this one will be my teacher for life, and I will listen to everything she does. She's my guru. He's my husband. Done. Anyone else going once? All right.
Bravo.
I'm done.
Okay. So one of the functions of the Poetry Corner is also to teach a little bit. So one kind of more teaching question then, what do you look for to make a poem good, or what do you value in both your own and others' poems?
I think the best piece of advice I've heard about writing was something that, again, Tony Hoagland was teaching us when we were 19-year-olds, and we all wanted to write. I didn't, because I was like a goody two-shoes, so I was like, I'll do whatever you say. Exactly, and they were terrible, my poems were terrible. But there was another guy in our class who wanted to like write these like stream of consciousness, like super trippy, psychedelic, like mind-boggling, like word groupings. It wasn't like they were sentences or anything. And I remember Tony he was always so playful. He was such a great teacher because he was so playful in his teaching. He put that guy on an abstraction diet.
Oh,
So
nice.
he was only allowed 1 abstraction per poem for the rest of the semester. And it was so sweet. Like it was like the guy wasn't like, oh, F you. It was like, he's a great teacher. But he said, I think he was talking to that guy, but I have carried it with me. He said, you have to learn the rules before you break them.
Right.
And so I just set out to learn the rules. And I don't mean the rules of, who knows what makes a good poem? It's a mystery. If we knew, we would be selling it, probably. That's what we do in this world. But I feel like I've set out to learn the rules of how to make a sentence. And so now I feel like I'm at the point where I can I don't think I've ever actually broken a rule, because I really am a goody two-shoes. But I really love it in poems where a poem just does something that seems a little bit like, I feel like I wanted to learn how to craft a poem until it was perfect. And then I realized that there is no such thing as perfect.
Right.
And then once you realize, once you awaken to that knowledge, the other becomes really appealing, So I like a poem that allows itself to show its dirtiness, or its making, A poem that feels like it's I just like a poem that feels like the realizations in the poem are being made in the moment.
You see the brushstrokes?
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that makes, Dean Young is a really amazing poet. And one of the reasons he's so amazing is because his mind can keep up with his thoughts. You know? You know what I mean? Like his mind
Being able to interpret.
or like, yeah, like sort of organizing things in a way that like that's coming at the speed of light, and he's able to sort of, or at least appear to be keeping up with it. Is Dean here? Thank God he's not here.
Okay.
I don't know, like, not thank God, like, I don't have a restraining order. He doesn't have a restraining order against me or anything, but, you know, hard to talk about a poet when they're in the room. But he's, you know, he's a poet that I really admire for that. But I like that. But you know, it's also just like, you don't, it's a hard balance to maintain. But that's what I'm really drawn to in reading poems.
What about your own aesthetic? Is there some things that, so some images or some biographical aspects that you prefer to go to, or the things you prefer to stay away from?
I think that's a really interesting question.
That means you're not going to answer it.
No, I don't know. I just think that like when you, like a question like that invites in so many like thoughts in my mind about like what poems get attention and what poets get attention and why, and
exactly.
I think more and more, like, I mean, I do think more and more that we hear more voices, you know? I think I'm drawn to voices.
Great.
That's what I'm drawn to
Explain.
you know.
Can you define
I mean, I think
voices?
that, you know, a human being behind a poem, you know? And what was the question you just asked? I'm sorry, I've lost it. I went
your aesthetic.
I can't keep up with my. I'm not.
Yeah, that's why we're better on paper sometimes, because I don't speak in synchronicity with my thoughts. So, but going back to that, so what things or subjects are you drawn to, and what things might you shy away from?
Yeah, so I think that, like, in my own experience, I feel really. When I was pregnant with my first child, and then had my first child, and then had my second child, I felt really drawn to write about the experience of being a child-bearing person. And I feel like only then did I really start to realize, like, just how strangely treacherous a territory the woman's body is in poetry, you know? And I think in some ways that, like, that sort of like goody two-shoes core that resides inside me, you know, like I went to school and I learned, and I wanted to learn, and I wanted to learn how to be good at this. And, you know, back in the 90s, and, you know, even into the, there were just like so few voices, and like there were these expert voices, and you know, you had to read and parse John Ashbery to make it to the next level, you know, because I'm just climbing the, and I feel like I've come to a point where I realize that there's a difference between being learned and being like awakened. And I feel like now I feel like much more. Like you sort of look around and go, oh, this is just all like, I mean, Mary Carr said it a couple weeks ago in the New York Times book review that like John Ashbery admits that he's just the emperor has no clothes. Like he's admitted himself that his poems don't mean anything. I mean, he has, right? So we'll just pick on him because she already did, and he's probably not going to watch this.
I don't know. He's got a service that anytime he's mentioned, he watches it.
He does on the internet, the John Ashbery net.
Yeah, he's got minions who.
You know, I think you get to a certain point and you go like, wow, I just want to hear voices, and I want other voices to be in the world, you know, women's voices, people of color, women who, you know, there was an essay in the American Poetry Review around the time that my book had been accepted, my second book, which is much about having a baby and being a parent, was accepted for publication between the time it was accepted and when it was published, and there was this whole article in American Poetry Review by poets that I really respect that was, it was like, it had like, I don't know if this essay coined the term, but it was about like mommy poetics and about, you know, entering into this, you know, topic without being too precious. And I just thought like, what world are we living in where the act of growing a being inside your body and then through great pain, bringing it into the world, risking life and limb
Mhm.
is this sort of like precious little thing that, oh, you know, let's just hope we get taken seriously. Like, you know what I mean? Like if, like, when the cameras stop rolling, the ranting will begin.
So,
You know?
are there things
So I was like sort of thinking like, God, am I so naive to think that like, I should be worried about this as a, you know, and then I just thought, that's just crazy.
Okay,
That's
good.
that's just, you know, so that's part about, you know, that's part of being awakened, like just, you know, realizing that everyone's voice is important in this world. And right now, some voices should be heard even louder than other voices. And God, you know, only because for eternity those voices have been heard, you know, and there is no danger to other voices being heard. I'm speaking so vaguely, but you know what I'm talking about.
Well, I'd like to, you do a fair amount of that, unexpected stuff. And so for your claimed goody two-shoes core, I can talk about rats or mice in paint cans, that
Yeah.
poem. There's another poem
God,
where...
rats really don't do very well.
No,
Vermin in general really.
sickening. Yeah, we're going to get to that in a minute. But also the poem about another segment of life you don't hear about or read about in poetry books is the poem where in high school you and your girlfriend are out, and apparently the only two women
Oh, yeah.
where the boys fight and they beat up the weakest one. That's some brutal stuff.
Yeah.
And not something we hear much about, or certainly within the realm of poetry. So, and then, so I want to talk about first a really excellent poem, amazing poem. I got to read it via Kirk, your husband, put it on Facebook. But it begins. So if you haven't read it, and we were working with it in class, and Katie's somewhere. She got the pleasure of our discussion. It's got beautiful jumps. But the beginning is it begins in a the whole framework's domestic. And it talks about filling out forms and the copying machine and washing your child's hair. But then it ends with an exploded rat in a trap. And the joy of the victory over that rat. And that's a pretty amazing twist. So I guess the point I'm making is, one, it's a great poem, but besides that, you sneak some stuff in that is quite unexpected. So, and you do go places, you know, I haven't read other poems about a rat. What's the flower you mentioned? It's not a poppy, it's a...
No, it's not.
a
I don't think it's a
peony?
flower.
No,
It's a
it's not a
strawberry.
flower? Strawberry,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
A rat with a strawberry in its mouth.
But that's right, that's the world, right?
That is the
And
world,
it makes
but
me
why don't we
wonder
see it
then
in
what
this other
if we're-
poems?
if that's a domestic poem, then what is a non-domestic poem? Like what is the other
Well, if you talk about like,
side of domestic?
so
the domestic.
the war guys, where they're out wherever they are, not being at home. You know, recently I was teaching the Iliad, and you've got the Trojans who are home, and the Greeks who are camped on the beach, wreaking havoc. But if you wanted to set up a dichotomy, I mean, you brought in the war poems a minute ago, so we could go there.
But do we have to go that far back? I mean, like
No, we don't need to.
contemporary. No, I mean,
I mean, you can go from here bullet to...
It's a rhetorical question.
Yes,
like,
okay.
what in American contemporary poetry isn't a domestic poem?
Well, here
I mean, I'm
bullet,
just being
yeah.
a jerk. But I
No,
mean, you know,
okay.
like it seems like to me, if a woman writes a poem about
Then it's
these
domestic.
things, then it's domestic.
Right.
But you know,
Well, I've got domestic poems.
yeah. Well, there you go. You're awakened. How many times can I use the word awakened? I'm going to start using it all the time now.
That's good. It's a good word.
Awakened.
Buddha means the awakened.
Yes, the awakened one. I think
Um,
our son's name has something to do with being awakened as well. Judah.
Judah Ben-Hur.
Judah Ben-Hur.
That's what I was thinking of. Well, we've probably done enough talking about, let's just,
You want me to read some poems?
I would love that. Would you like the lectern?
Oh, and can I just sit here? I have a big voice. Is it all right, or would you like me to stand? I could stand if you guys in the back. What do you think, Kirk?